Hello, it's Pam again at Quilt Beginnings in Dublin, Ohio, and today we're going to focus on your basic utility stitches and the feet that come with the machines. So when you turn your sewing machine on, if it's sewing or sewing and embroidery, so I'm working on the Solaris, so I have sewing and embroidery, but if you're on a Crescendo or an Aria or one of those machines, you're just going to have the sewing field. So anyways, to get started, we're going to go ahead and touch the sewing category. And when I touch the sewing category, depending on which machine you're on, you may have your categories across the top of your machine, or you may have the categories going down here. So depending on which machine you're on, the screen may look a little different, but your icons are going to be very much the same. So when we turn the machine on and we go to sewing, you're going to notice that the machine always defaults to stitch 03. And if you look at the top, you're going to see that that is the straight stitch in the middle. So what happens is if it defaulted to stitch 01 and I come over to here, you're going to see that that's straight stitch left position, and it puts your needle in the far left position. You can set your machine so it comes up to that stitch, but you want to make sure if you do that you have your open plate on. So I'm going to remove my plate from the Solaris and show you that this one has an opening right here. Some of the plates have a single hole opening and there's only a single hole in the middle. So that's why the machine defaults to stitch 3, so it's straight stitch in the middle, so that if you don't have on the right foot or you don't have on the right stitch plate, you're going to be okay, you won't break a needle. So we're going to leave the machine at the default, and we are going to go to stitch 103, and that's where every machine defaults to. When you look at this, you're going to see that it tells you what foot that you're going to use. So we're going to be using the J foot. People ask me all the time, where are the feet marked? So if I take off my J foot, and to take a foot off, you simply push on the black button on the back of the ankle, and the foot falls down. And if you look at your foot, all of the feet are marked, and you can usually find it right in the middle. And there's a J there. It's hard to see on camera, but that is the J foot. The foot letter should always be facing you when you sew. So some of the feet feel kind of weird when you put them on. For example, the buttonhole foot. So just know that the foot needs to be facing you. You're going to see that the foot has a little bar here. And if you look on the side of your ankle, there's an indentation. So if you look from the side, it's very easy just to push this foot straight up and click it on. Now, some people like to take and drop the foot on. So if you press this and drop the ankle, it will go on. But if you have a foot with a flange, it makes it difficult to do. So this is straight stitch in the middle. And when we look on our screen, you're going to see that there's width, length, and on some machines it has left, right, shift, and tension. So what this means is these are the defaults. So if it doesn't have left, right, shift, if you change the width on a straight stitch, you're simply changing your needle position. Anything that's in a black box is the default. So if I want to change my length, if I depress this, this is making it a longer stitch. And if I press and hold, it stops. So 5.0, that would be a basting stitch. Now I'm going to come over here and I can hit reset, and it takes it back to the black box. If you change anything on your machine from default, when you turn the machine off and back on, it resets. So if you change a stitch and you really like it and you want that to be your default, you simply need to depress memory, and it will save that in memory, and when you turn your machine on, it will always come to that stitch. So some of the machines don't have the left-right shift, but the width is what would change the needle position. Here, if I change the left-right shift, it moves my needle position. So you have one or the other, and you can play with that. So when you turn your machine on, it comes to straight stitch in the middle. Okay, so I just want to show you the different functions on here. So I'm using white thread on denim fabric so you can see it. So when I depress my presser foot, and I start, and I'm going to slow this machine down so you can see. The machine is just simply going to sew out of the box. So it's not doing any tie-off stitch. It's just sewing. Notice when I stop, on most of your machines, it's not going to put the needle down and raise the presser foot. If you'll look here, this has already been depressed, okay? But out of the box, this is not depressed. So when I'm sewing, every time I stop, the needle stays in the down position, but I can't really rotate my fabric. And when I get finished, if I wanted to do a tie off, I would have to hit the reverse button and cut the thread. So let me just cut the thread and show you. It had a lot of steps to do this. So you have some fast, easy steps on your machine, and they're right here. So this reverse button and your scissors, if you have both of those depressed, it tells the machine that you want to do a tie off when you start sewing. Some of your machines show that the needle can end in the down position or the up position, but the machines also have what we call a pivot function. So if I depress this key, it gives you the pivot function. So now when I start sewing, it's going to do a tie off. So right now it's going to do a tie off in the form of forward, backward, forward. So if you watch, I'm going to kind of do it in slow motion. It's doing 3 stitches forward, 3 backwards. There's my tie off, and it's sewing. Notice now that when I stop, because I have the pivot function, now I can pivot. I don't have to put my presser foot back down. I simply step on the foot pedal, and it goes again. And when I stop sewing, needle down, presser foot up, so it gives me the pivot function. Now, when I get to the end, because I have those tie-offs engaged, I can either touch the reverse button or the end of pattern button. So I'm going to touch the reverse button. It does 3 backwards, 3 forwards, cut the threads, and lifts the presser foot. So I don't have to handle all of these. It does it automatically. So I wanted to explain the difference between stitch 103 and 104. If you look at stitch 103, you're going to see 2 little hash marks at the top. That's telling you that your tie-off is going to be in the form forward, backward, forward. If you look at my fabric, you're going to see that there's the thickness of thread right there. That's usually covered in your 1/4 inch seam allowance. If I choose, however, stitch number 104, you're going to see that there's a little dot at the top. So what that's going to do, if my tie-off is going to be in the form of 3 little stitches all in one place, so that if you're sewing on thin fabric, lingerie, or you have a really small seam allowance, you don't want to see that tie-off. So now when I step on the foot pedal, it's going to do 3 little stitches in one place. So we're doing 1, 2, 3, and then it starts sewing. Again, when I stop, needle down, presser foot up. This time, if I go to my end of pattern button, it's going to do a tie off at the end of the pattern, and in this case, it's just a single stitch. So you can see here that my tie off, you can barely see. There is a knot there, but it's not the heavy knot like we're seeing on this one. So whenever you look at your stitches on your machine, if you see 2 little hashtags, like on stitch 101, your tie-off's going to be in the form forward, back, forward. And if you see a little dot, like on stitch 102 or 104, your tie-off is going to be in the form of 3 little dots. If you touch this one, it does a forward, back, forward tie-off, and this one does the single tie-offs. And those are going to change a little bit when we get to decorative stitches, so you'll want to play with that. Again, if I wanted to change my length, my width, I change it here, and if I hit reset, it puts it back to the default. Let's look at a zigzag stitch. So I'm going to go to stitch 109, and again, it might be different depending on what model you're on, but when I depress 109, it shows you my zigzag stitch in real time, and it shows the J-foot. Okay, so if I do a zigzag stitch, and I'm just going to do a little zigzag stitch right here. You can see it did a tie off. When I stop, the needle goes down, presser foot up. But if I play with my length or my width, so let's make the width wider, and you can see as I press and hold and I make it wider, it changes real time on the screen. And I'm going to make my stitch narrower, shorter. And you can see that I'm getting a pretty heavy zigzag stitch. So I want to show you the difference. When I go ahead and stitch this stitch, it starts doing a stitch, and you're going to see that all of a sudden the fabric stops feeding. So this shows that we're going to use our J foot, but I want to show you the difference between 2 feet. So this is a beautiful satin stitch, but it's eventually going to stop in the machine. And the reason why is the foot. So this is a J foot right here. And I'm also going to pull out my N foot. So if you pull both feet out, you're going to see that they look very similar on the top. The J is marked here, the N is marked here. If I turn them over, you can see that the J foot stops. So it's open to here, and then all of a sudden we've got a solid back. So what happens is that zigzag stitch is going through. When that zigzag, after you've gone about 3/8 of an inch, there's no place for that zigzag stitch to form. But if you look at the N foot, I have an open channel here. So whenever you're using a heavy satin stitch, even if it says a J foot, I would recommend changing to an N foot so that that zigzag, that heavy, whatever stitch it is, but it's just a heavy, thick stitch, it can form right underneath this channel. So if you have an issue using a zigzag or any of the decorative stitches that are very tight, you're probably going to want to put on your N foot so that it has a place for that stitch to go underneath the foot. Okay, so that is your zigzag and your straight stitch. Okay, so next, let's look at a stretch stitch. So a lot of people get home and they start sewing, and we as quilters sew on cotton fabric, but all of a sudden they'll sew on something that's stretchy, and they'll use their regular sewing stitch. So I just want to show you real quick that if I were to use my straight stitch, just a straight stitch in the middle, and I start sewing down, and I take it out of here, what's going to happen is when I pull on this, it's going to break the thread. So just know that there are different stitches on your machine for different kinds of fabrics and different applications. So if you're looking for your stretch stitch, on most machines it's stitch 05, and if you're unsure, if you look up here, it says triple stretch stitch. So whenever you're sewing on stretchy fabric, it helps to use a jersey needle. And when I'm sewing on this, if you think about this, when you're using a stretch stitch, this is going to get stretched over something, a cuff, your waist, whatever. So you're going to pull on this just a little bit, because no matter how we sew this, unless I'm on a serger, when I pull, you're going to expect a thread to break. So if I use my triple stretch stitch and I go ahead and put my presser foot down, I'm just going to pull on this a little bit, but you can see that the stitch, it does kind of a forward, back, forward, thus the triple. And it causes the fabric to, it will pucker a little bit because it's a stretch fabric. But when I get finished and take it out of here, I'm going to show you what it looks like. And this I can pull on and it doesn't break. If you have any questions, your feet are in your book. But when I pull up my triple stretch stitch, on your baby lock machine, and this is a really nice feature, there's a question mark. So if I touch the question mark and I go into pattern explanation, it will tell you what the stitch is and what its application is. And then it shows you at the bottom what the defaults are. So if you have any questions on what something is used for, don't hesitate. Baby Lock has a built-in pattern explanation, and it'll tell you what that stitch is for. Okay, the next stitch that we're going to do is the overcasting stitch. Okay, and on the overcasting stitch, we're going to use the G foot. One thing that I wanted to show you is a lot of your machines come with this really cool tray. So the Solaris has 3 trays. Some of the machines have 1 tray. But as you press your feet in here, if they're incorrectly, when you turn it over, nothing's going to fall out. Now, if you're constantly using your utility stitches, this part of your machine also opens up, and this fits beautifully in there. So it only houses one tray at a time, but if you're sewing, this general foot tray is the one that I would keep in while I'm sewing. Okay, so to do an overcasting stitch, an overcasting finishes the edge of something. So the overcasting stitch is the G-foot. So I'm going to take my G-foot out. I'm going to pop off my J-foot and put my G-foot on. The one thing I want to show you about the G-foot, it's marked G, but there's this little flange right here. So the idea when I'm doing my overcasting stitch is to put my fabric right up against this flange so that it's your marker for the fabric. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on, and there are several overcasting stitches. They're listed in your manual, but they're also shown here right on the screen. So if I go to my overcasting stitch, on the Solaris, it starts at stitch 116. So it always looks like a stitch that has a straight line and it kind of bows out to the right. And when I touch this stitch, you're going to see it shows that I need my G-foot, and it's an overcasting stitch. So 116, 17, 18, 19, 20, they're all for different things. So if I go to my question mark and my pattern explanation, 116 reinforces light and medium weight fabrics. I'm on jean fabric, so I'm going to go a little bit heavier. Again, if I don't know, I'm going to hit return and close. 117, let's see what that one's for. I'm going to go to my question mark, my pattern explanation, and it says heavyweight fabric. So that's what I'm going to use for my jean fabric. Again, use the built-in tutorials. So now when I place my fabric here, I want to put it so that my fabric is right up against the edge of that foot. So my fabric's going to go right up against that little flange, same as if I were using a 1/4 inch foot. And I'm just going to step on it. And here is an overcasting stitch. So it doesn't replace a serger, but it's certainly quick if you just want to go ahead and finish one edge of a fabric. Okay, the next stitch is going to be the blind hem stitch. And the blind hem stitch is going to be in category 2. And it is, so up here or on the side is where your stitches are. And the blind hem stitches run from 201 to 204, thereabouts, depending which machine you're on. So this is a blind hem stitch, and this is what we use often to do hems, especially on men's pants or hems of a skirt, something like that. The hardest part about the blind hem stitch is getting the fabric in the machine correctly. So when we do a blind hem stitch, it's best if you press it, and we usually take and fold the fabric up twice so that there's no raw edge. I'm going to try to make it easy for you to remember. If this were a pair of pants or a skirt, okay, and think of as an adult pair of pants, I don't want the pants jammed up in here. There's not enough room. So we always want the bulk of the fabric to be on the left of the machine, so it's hanging off the machine bed. We are also going to work from the inside of the pants. So pretend this is my pants, and what I've got here is I folded it twice. The bulk is hanging to the left of the machine, and the inside of the pants are showing. What you want to do then is you're going to fold it, and this is the hardest part to remember. I'm taking my fabric and folding it back like this. So the bulk is still hanging there. This is my hem, this is the pants. So I'm going to show you that again. It's folded over twice. I'm simply folding my fabric back one time, and I want about a 1/4 inch to show. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop my presser foot, and I want the flange right up against the fold. And this takes just a little bit of practice, but you can get good real quick. You always want to sew on fabric. And if you think about it, on a blind hem, your hems are circular. So you've got a finished pant leg or a finished skirt leg. So you are always going to be sewing on fabric. And I usually start near a seam, but I'm going to sew, and I'm using white thread. I would not be using white thread on black fabric, but I want to make sure that I'm pushing my fabric into the fold. And I'm doing this from an angle. And it's going to take 3 stitches on the folded fabric, and then it's going to bite the fabric. So I'm going to pull this out, and when we look at it, you're getting 3 stitches here, and then it bites the fabric. 3 stitches, and it bites the fabric. So now, when I pull my pant leg back like this and open it up, I have a little bite like that. That's what you want your blind hem to look like. So again, it was in the machine like this. I pressed it against my fold. It does 3 or 4 stitches and then bites the fabric. When I pull it open, this is what I'm going to see on the inside, but you're not going to use white thread. You're going to use something that shows. And when I turn my pant leg over, it looks like this. If you get large stitches, you need to make an adjustment. You can do it with your width or how close that fold is. But this is a pretty good stitch length right here. It's going to hold and it's not going to show. So that's your blind hem. And again, you have several different blind hems to choose from. And you can go to that question mark pattern explanation and see which to use on stretch fabrics, which to use on woven fabric, and which ones to use on heavy fabric. Okay, the next thing I wanted to mention was the strength of this machine. So let's pretend we were doing a jeans hem. So here's a seam, and I cut the fabric so that you can see that there's a seam in here. And I'm going to fold this like I was doing a decorative hem on a pair of jeans. So now I have the fold, and I folded the fabric over twice. So I'm going to go through this thickness, and I just want you to see that the baby lock machine can sew through all of this. So I'm going to go ahead and just sew through, because people worry, is this machine, will I break a needle, can I go through? And you can see that it's sewed right over all of that, no problem at all. So it'll go through many layers, beautiful stitch, so don't be afraid to sew on any kind of fabric. Okay, so as we move through the categories, we kind of touched on category 1, which has a lot of your straight zigzag stitches, all of that. And if you look here, on some of your machines, you can scroll through like this, or if you have a bar or an arrow here, we can scroll through this. And on some of your machines, you just have an arrow here and at the top, so you can scroll through. So these are a lot of the stitches that we use for everyday sewing. Category 2 is some decorative stitches, some other stitches which we'll get to in just a minute. Category 3 is more of the same. Category 4 is where we're going to find our buttonholes. So if you touch the buttonholes, you're going to see that the buttonholes that look complete, those are one-step buttonholes. In other words, you just put it on, touch the go button, and it makes the buttonhole. The buttonholes that don't look complete towards the bottom, those are buttonholes that you're going to have to do some measuring on, and it takes a little bit of finesse to do that. So basically, the bottom line is, if your button fits in your buttonhole foot, you can do it as a one-step buttonhole. I'm going to show you this in just a second. If the button is too big and it doesn't fit in the A foot, then you're going to have to do a manual buttonhole where you're actually going to have to measure it. Now, if you have an embroidery machine, the embroidery machine has buttonholes built in, and so you can do buttonholes up to 4 inches, and that makes it easier. So just make sure, if you want the easiest buttonhole, that you've got to choose a button, not one of those gigantic decorative buttons, but something that fits in the A foot. So we've got 2 different kinds of buttonhole feet for the baby lock machines. Most of them, with the exception of the Solaris, comes with this A foot. And you can see there's the A. And as I mentioned before, the A needs to be facing you. It's going to hook onto your machine at this little bar, the same way that all of your feet go on. On this foot, you're going to see that you have a silver bar and a white plastic bar. This moves up and down at the back of the foot. If I pull this down, the button has to fit in the back here. So I'm going to take my button and I'm going to pull it down, okay? If your button is bigger than this space, so about 1.25 inches, you're going to have to do a manual buttonhole or go to your embroidery field if you have that. So I'm going to go ahead and push this button in here, okay? And if you are on one of the other machines, not the Solaris, the way this works is the distance between the silver bar and this plastic bar is the same distance as your buttonhole. So if I were on a Destiny or an Ariel, not a Pathfinder, that's an embroidery only, but if I were on any of the Crescendos, Arias, any of those machines, my buttonhole foot is going to clip on like this. Okay, so we're going to hook this on, and you can see this slides back and forth. On most of your machines, there's a little gray plastic piece up here that you're going to pull down, and you're going to pull it down behind this silver piece. What happens is when you start the machine, that silver piece, it's going to move, and when that gray tab hits here, it knows to make the tack and start back the other way. So if you understand the way the machine's working, I think it makes it easier to understand how the buttonhole is forming. If you don't pull that bar down, the machine is going to give you a message on your screen and it's going to say pull that bar down. You have to pull it all the way down. Don't be afraid, you can't make a mistake. The baby lock machine tells you exactly what you have to do. If you're on a Solaris, your foot is going to look like this, and your button is going to go in the front of the machine. So we're going to pull yours back and forth like this. And you don't have to worry about that gray piece there. Your buttonhole foot has 2 pieces. And what that allows you to do is if you have fragile garments or things with a lot of threads in there, you can slide your fabric in between so it doesn't grab your fabric. Your buttonhole foot is going to fit on the same way. The A is going to be facing you. And again, you can either drop this down onto the foot or push up on it. Okay? And then, if you look at your foot, no matter which one you're on, you're going to see that there are these 3 little red tick marks. Pretend you are making a T in there. The top of the T is where the buttonhole is going to start. And the way the buttonhole works, it starts at the bottom of the buttonhole and works backwards. So if you had several buttonholes that you had to put in, you want to line up your fabric so that if I formed an imaginary T, it's going to start at the crosshairs of that T. So once I have my foot on, I've got my button in. If I'm on a Solaris, it's in the front. If I'm on one of the other machines, it's in the back. I'm going to lower my presser foot. And again, on the Solaris, I've just got this between the 2 layers so you can see. And when I drop this, I'm going to choose my buttonhole, so let me choose this one. And if your machine allows you, on some machines you can adjust the length and width of the stitch. So if you don't think that the buttonhole has enough stitches in it, feel free to adjust your width or your length. I always say practice first to make sure you like the look of the buttonhole. But I can either use the start-stop button or I can use my foot control to run it. If I'm going to use my start-stop, I have to have the foot control disconnected. So again, when it's green, you can go, and I'm simply going to drop my presser foot, press the button, and it's going to do my buttonhole. Okay, so here's the finished buttonhole, and again, I can adjust the length of the width, and the easiest way I find to cut the buttonhole is just to put a pin through here and use my seam ripper and cut up. That way when it hits the pin, it stops and it doesn't break the buttonhole stitches. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is actually sew the button on. Okay, so now we're going to sew the button on, and I don't sew any buttons on by hand anymore because this machine sews them on so easily. So what we're going to use to sew the buttons on is the M foot, and once again the M is marked on here. You're going to go on your machine and you're going to look for the first stitch after your buttonholes, which is usually stitch 423. And when I touch it, you're going to see that it says button sewing and it tells me to use my M foot. You may notice automatically that it drops the feed dogs. Okay, the M foot is a very interesting foot for a lot of reasons. So first of all, if you look on the side here, there is this plastic thing that shifts forward and back. And it's going to be really hard to see on camera because I know it's hard to see in class, but when I pull this forward, it puts a plastic piece across this bar right here. So when I pull it back, it's off, and when I pull it down, it puts a plastic piece there. So if you are a garment sewer, you know that if you are sewing a button that's going to be a functional button, not a decorative button, you need a little bit of play in there. So think about if you purchase a wool coat. Sometimes you feel like the button is just hanging off, like it's almost going to fall off. Well, you need that extra thread in there so that the wool coat, when you button it, it has a place to go. So if you're doing, the thicker your fabric is, the more you need of that loose thread there, which is called a shank. So with this pull forward, that creates a shank, and it's a very generous shank. So you do want to play around with it. I remember when I had my first sewing machine, we used to put like a toothpick or a pin underneath your button when you sewed it on, so you'd have a little bit of give in the button. Well, that's what this does. You're going to find it's very generous, so I would start by not using that, but if I were using really thick fabric, you do want that button to be a little bit looser. The second thing that you're going to do is you're going to put this button, and we're going to put it on the bottom, this bottom ledge, and stick it into the foot. So it's going pushing down on the metal, and the idea is to get the buttonholes lined up with the two red dots. Now, if you've got a 4-hole button, you want to do the bottom 2 holes first, and it's going to make sense when I actually stitch this out. So I've put my button in with only 2 holes showing. I've touched my stitch 423, and now I'm going to go and attach the foot to my machine on this metal bar. Okay, once I have my foot attached, I'm going to put my fabric underneath here so that I can see what I'm doing. And we always want to check our buttonhole. Always, always, always manually check your buttonhole. What I like to do is just pull a little bit of thread out to ensure that it picks up the bobbin thread, and I'm going to drop my presser foot, and we want to manually hand crank our wheel, our hand wheel, towards us 1 whole revolution, and you can see that I can see that it's cleared that buttonhole. If it doesn't clear the hole, just take your seam ripper and adjust it so that it does. Now, most of your buttons have a default. It's a standard width, so your width on your machine is probably going to work. But we've gone to these really big buttons today, so if you have a bigger button, you may have to adjust your width. But I want to hand crank the wheel to clear the first hole, and then to make sure it clears the second hole. It has to clear both holes. Once it clears both of those holes, again, I can either use my presser foot or I can use the start stop. So I'm just going to touch the start stop, and it's going to do my button. It's sewing it on. If I have my tie-offs depressed, it would automatically do a tie-off. So I'm going to go ahead and depress those. And I always run it twice. I figure if once is good, twice is better, because I never want to sew that buttonhole on again. So I'm going to go ahead and run it a second time. Okay, again, I like to run it twice just because most of my buttons are decorative buttons and I don't want anybody pulling the button off. But when I'm finished, when I put my presser foot up, the reason why I did the bottom 2 holes first is to take this off, I've got to pull it forward. So this way I can just nudge it forward just a tad, line those buttonholes up again so that they line up with the holes. Drop my presser foot, but always check. So I'm going to check again, make sure it clears both holes, and then hit my start stop. And when you're done, you're just going to pull it forward. So if you look, the bottom buttonhole was run twice, the top one was run once. It's all a matter of preference, but I've got a nice button sewn on very quickly. And I do a lot of decorative projects where I add a lot of buttons, and it really is quick to do it this way. Also, I do a lot of projects that have embellishments added. So if you were adding, let's say, a freestanding lace flower or a little butterfly or twine or something like that, or anytime I have to do a bow, I will use this tack down to tack it down really quickly. I like to sew smart. I don't say fast, I like to sew smart. So feel free to use that stitch to tack anything down that you need to tack down. The next foot that everyone gets in their treasure of feet is the eye foot, which is the zipper foot. And the eye foot allows you to move the needle over close to zipper teeth or cording or things like that. Now the eye foot either goes on the left or the right. So it can't go in the middle. You can either sew, so if I were putting a zipper in, I can move my needle to the left, or if I'm on this side, I can move my needle to the right. So basically, when I put the zipper foot on, and I'm going to choose the left side, when I put it on here and I drop my zipper foot, if I go to my width, or on the case of the Solaris, if I do my left-right shift, it moves the needle to the left position so that I can get as close to that zipper as I want to, or if I'm doing cording, I can get as close to that cording as I need to. So the zipper foot's just a standard zipper foot that allows you to get close to things that would otherwise get in the way. Because if I had a regular presser foot, that would come down on the teeth or my cording or whatever it is that I'm attaching to my fabric. Okay, so the feet that come with most of the machines fit in this one tray. And the one foot that used to be included that isn't included anymore is the V foot. And that's your vertical stitch alignment foot. And basically it was just a foot that has a long measurement, about 1 inch long to the right of the foot, so that if you were doing really accurate sewing on garments and you needed to get to the 1/16 of an inch, it has that measurement on there. It's not included with the machines anymore, but it's certainly a foot that we can get for you. And if you have any questions, give us a call. We can tell you other feet. There's all kinds of optional feet listed in your manuals, and we can get any of those for you. Okay, if we come back up to our navigation plate, we kind of went through some stitches in category 1, 2, 3, 4 is buttonholes. But another cool feature that is on the machine is directional sewing, which is category number 5. So on some of the machines, you can only sew left, right, forward, and backwards. On some of the machines, you also get the 45-degree option. And then on the Solaris and some of the upper end machines, you also get those, but you can do them in a zigzag stitch as well as a straight stitch. So if you were going to sew like a, let's say, a label on a bag, it's kind of hard to maneuver a bag in and out of here, turning it without jamming things up. So think about it, if I took off my accessory plate, I could put my bag onto here, lay my label on top of the bag, and without turning my bag in any way, I can sew in multiple directions. So for instance, let's say I wanted to sew towards the right. On this machine, I'm going to touch stitch 505, and when I drop my presser foot, it's going to sew towards me, so towards the right. So here it comes, sewing towards the right. So you could see how easy that would be to add on to a bag. Now if I want to sew down or forward, I would hit the key or the icon that shows it coming forward. And on this machine, it's stitch 507. So again, when I start it, it's going to sew forward. And then if I wanted to sew back to the left, I would touch my stitch 504 on this machine, and it's going to sew to the left. So you can see how easy it would be to put a label on a bag without turning it. Okay, another cool feature that it has is, and again, I could finish sewing my square. I've got the option of doing a zigzag stitch, so if you were adding a label and you wanted to do kind of a satiny stitch around the edge. But then think about binding. Let's say that you want to do that 45-degree angle on your binding. I can touch this stitch, number 508, and it is going to sew at a 45-degree angle. So there are a lot of built-in stitches here that make sewing on your baby lock really easy. So you can see, without turning the bag, I could sew an entire square, or I could do the 45-degree angle in my sewing. Okay, and then the last category is Q, or Quilter's category. And a lot of people ask what this category is. These are stitches that are in your other categories, but what happens is these are stitches that they say quilters use a lot. So P are piecing. There's the zigzag. You've got your blanket stitch. So if you wanted to, you could go into your settings page. So I'm going to go home first. And I'm going to touch my sewing category. And when I touch sewing, you see that it comes up to straight stitch in the middle. And my default in utility stitch is the straight stitch in the middle. If I go into my settings, I could go, and again, it might be different depending on which machine you're on. But if I scroll through where you see initial page, I could turn it to Q and touch OK. Now, when I turn my machine off and back on, it's automatically going to come up to the Q, or quilter stitch. So I like to leave things as they are default. And again, when you change that, you have to turn it off and back on. But the Q's is just quilter stitches, and you can set your machine so that it automatically goes to that category. So one thing that I wanted to mention at the top was the laser pointer. And on some of your machines, the laser pointer is down here. And then I will cover this more in depth when I do the upgrades on the machines. But if we touch the laser pointer, and on the Solaris, you've got a main and a subcategory. So right now, just the main category is on. So I can change the color. And let me see if I can make it white. Okay, so I can change the color of this line, and I don't know if you can see it on this fabric, but anyways, you can go in and play with that. And what that does is I can move my line over to a 1/4 inch so that I could use that as a 1/4 inch foot. So on most of your machines, it's just going to be down here. You're going to play with it, and it allows you to set your guidelines. But this will be covered in a future video when we go into the upgrades on the machine. Okay. The other thing I want to talk about real quick is free motion quilting, because people ask about that all the time. So in free motion quilting, we are still going to use our stitch 103. Now, if you are on the other machines other than the Solaris, you're going to see a line down here. If you're on a Solaris, this is your edit button, so I'm going to touch it here to bring that up. So if you're on a Solaris, touch this, and the rest of you are going to see something that looks like this. This little thing that looks like a flying staple is dropping your feed dogs. So when I touch this, it drops my feed dogs. So with this highlighted, my feed dogs are down. So now I can do free motion quilting. And free motion quilting, there's all kinds of classes that Quilt Beginnings offers that you can take to learn how to use rulers and do free motion quilting. But I just basically want to show you there are several feet that come with the Solaris. Most of you got the O foot, which means it's open toe, and it is also used for a free motion quilting. There are several other feet like echo quilting, detail quilting, etc. But you're going to see that this is not a snap-on foot. It doesn't fit on that bar on the ankle. So for this one, we're going to have to take off this entire piece. So some of you got a screwdriver. It looks like a quarter with a hole in the middle. A lot of you got this multifunction screwdriver, and there's 3 places. This one allows you to get easily to these screws. If I put it in position 2, for those of you who have a plate that uses screws, this works really well on those screws. And then for those of you who have embroidery machines, if we push this all the way in, and you're going to push it all the way in until this screwdriver actually shows in here, and it's got to be in all the way. This is what you use on your hoops to tighten the hoops. So a lot of you are having hard times tightening them. Just move this so it clicks into position 3. You can see the screwdriver in here, and it's used to tighten your hoops. But I'm going to take this back to position number 1, and I'm going to loosen my screw. Now this screw, to loosen it, I'm going to screw it towards the back of the machine or counterclockwise. Don't take that screw all the way out. It's really hard to get back in. But I like to keep this ankle connected to a foot because this is really easy to lose. And if you lose it, you're not going to be able to sew until you get it replaced. So I usually leave this hooked on when I put on one of my other feet. This, if you see the little opening here, approach it from the back, put that part over the screw, and then tighten this. And you want to make sure whenever you change your ankle on or off, or put one of these feet that go over the screw, that you tighten it. Remember, your machine is doing about 1,000 stitches per minute, so you want to make sure that this is on good and tight. So when we're doing free motion quilting, the feed dogs are dropped. You know, I'm just going to grab a hold of this thread, and we usually do needle down, needle up, needle down, needle up, pop up the bobbin thread, grab those, and we're off and free motioning. Now, again, that's a class in its own, but the one thing that I want to point out is when you deactivate your little staple. So now I've told it, I no longer want my feed dogs down. When I take that off, my feed dogs don't come up, and people will call in and say my feed dogs didn't come up. That's correct. You have to take a stitch for them to come up. So if you just go to your hand wheel and crank it once, you'll see that your feed dogs come back up and you're back in business. So that kind of concludes utility stitches. Again, we were sewing in the utility stitches. Kind of gives you an overview of the feet that come with the machine, how to activate those stitches, and I hope you found something useful in the video, and look forward to our next video in which we will cover decorative stitches. See you then.